So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Audrea Lim. I'm an editor. For a long time I was an editor at Rebozo Books, and I still do, contract editing, book editing for a bunch of different places. Yeah, thank you all for coming and this is a panel on radical publishing. I'm just gonna let everybody introduce themselves quickly, and then we can just get started. Start with Jisu maybe? Oh yeah, you and what publishing house you do. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Jisu Kim. I work at the Feminist Press, which is an almost 48-year-old feminist publishing house, as you might be able to guess. We're based in Manhattan, and we do print books.
I'm Lindsey. I currently live in Mexico, and I'm originally from here, so I come back and forth, and I participate with Rebozo, Palapa, Editorial. It's a small press that started about 7 years ago. We're based in Mexico. Not been around for 50 years, it's been about 7. But about 4 years ago we started also printing material in English, because originally it was all in Spanish, and trying to kind of create these cross-border dialogues and translating material in both languages that's maybe not getting into the other, and vice versa.
Oh, do you want to maybe say, just list 1 or 2 books or chapbooks or whatever that you recently published that you're super proud of?
I'm just gonna go for whatever is recent. We published Michelle T, who you might all be familiar with. She's an author and literary organizer. We published her essay collection Against Memoir in May. And then this September, our big book was Sarah Schulman's most recent novel, Maggie Perry. Personally, earlier this spring, we published this anthology in conjunction with the Asian American Writers Workshop called Go Home, that I'm especially proud of.
Yeah, I'll just mention too, we do a lot of pamphlets or booklets, and not as many larger run books. So that means we have a lot of titles and publish many during the year. So 2 that we just published, they're shorter works. One is Rita Segato. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of her. She's a feminist author. She lives in Brazil. She's from Argentina. Has spent a lot of time in Mexico as well. And it's we have it in English and Spanish. It's From Margin to Center. It's kind of around the idea that we need to refound feminism in order to refound politics. So it's this whole idea that if we don't integrate feminism, feminist thinking in a different way, which she goes into, and what she talks about too is integrating men into that process as well, or not just one gender into that process. That's the only way that we can transform politics. And then the other I mention is, it's a series by Abdullah Öcalan, political prisoner of the Kurdish movement and leader of the Kurdish movement. It's a kind of 3 series, 3 essays that he's written, which, if anyone wants to know the titles, I'll tell you later. They're long. Yeah.
I'm Lantz. I'm with Radix Media. We're a worker-owned union print shop and publisher. We've been around in some form or another since 2010, and traditionally have been doing more commercial printing and small chapbook publishing. And then earlier this year, we released the first book that we've published, called Aftermath: Explorations of Loss and Grief. It's an anthology with different writers and artists working in poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and photography and illustration as well. Just speaking about loss, grief, and kind of how to process those things. And yeah, we are super excited to have that out. We also have another project forthcoming that's going to be a series of science fiction chapbooks called Futures. So those are gonna start trickling out into the world later this year or early next year, and then we'll do a box set late next year.
Thanks. So originally, by the way, we were going to have one more person, Lynn from the operating system, which is based in Bushwick, which they happen to be 6, so you're just stuck with the 4 of us. But so, yeah, to begin, as radical publishers, I'm just wondering, how do you understand your relationship as publishers to like the social movements that you're looking to support? I mean, do you see yourselves as like part of the movement, or are you a little bit independent?
I can start. Yeah, Rebozo, our project started definitely like in the understanding itself as a tool within the movement, not necessarily something outside. And it's actually discussions that we've, in Mexico, we definitely participate in a lot of different like, independent book fairs, and they are discussions that we have often, and I don't think there's like a right way or a wrong way to do it. There's definitely a lot of independent presses that we respect a lot, but definitely kind of have this outside perspective and maybe are observing and trying to digest things that the movement is going through and speaking from an outside perspective. We definitely feel all the people that are part of Rebozo, which right now we're 4, at one point we were 7, it's kind of gone up and down, but we all have many different activities that we're involved in, so this is just like kind of one of the tools that we use to tackle like a few different things. We kind of always envisioned it as a convivial tool to awaken our imaginations, to open our hearts, and also to learn about different struggles that are happening around the world that can be like a reference or a source of reflection for us. And so we kind of try and use it like in our own collectives, in our own spaces. There are also these references and critical resources that we have where we can discuss them together. We always try and encourage people to discuss our texts in collective. We ourselves use them in our collectives. So
it's kind of like an organizing tool.
An organizing tool, definitely like a political formation tool. We envision ourselves that way. And we just try and be kind of in sync always with what's happening. So when we look at, if you look like historically over the 7 years, the texts that we've printed, they've always kind of coincide with things that are happening in our country, in Mexico or around the world. So it's kind of in sync.
Can you give some examples?
So, for example, in 2012, when there was the big movement of Yo Soy 132, the student movement, personally, we were all also participating in a kind of free learning, free university kind of space, similar to like free university here, called Unitierra. So there was a lot of reflection going around about student movements, what it means to be a student, what it means to learn in a free way. And so we published, a series around criticizing, pedagogy, rethinking through what it means to learn. We published Deschooling Society, that was actually our first text, an Ivanovic book, which is a criticism of the institution that is school. So that was kind of where, it's like in sync, both on a personal, collective level, as well as like on a movement level. That's just an example.
So, I mean, in a sec, I want to go back to like how you actually, once there's this movement happening, how do you decide like who do you want to get to write about it? But before we get there, I just want to hear from the two of you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely consider Radix Media a project that's kind of part of the movement. I mean, before we were publishing, and even before we were commercial printers, we did a lot of design work for social justice groups, and a lot of the commercial printing we do is for folks doing some type of, whether it is labor organizing, or other types of social justice work. In terms of publishing, I mean, I think that, there are a lot of, especially in the political climate right now, there are a lot of stories that there are a lot of people that have stories that that you may not necessarily find at like, the Radical Book Fair or whatever. Stories about immigration, stories about, dealing with healthcare in a country with basically without affordable healthcare. So I definitely think there are ways for us to kind of connect with different movements and different people within those movements, and also people outside of that who are maybe kind of just getting involved for the first time, and just being able to give a platform to people who otherwise might not have that opportunity for whatever reason.
I think that in 2018, like this word feminist or feminist press or like feminism has gone through many years, not even just the 48 years of like baggage that we've had since 1970, when our founder decided to call the press the feminist press. And so I think it's sort of like odd to think about. Obviously feminism, especially now, like has so many different faces. People think about it in different ways. It's become really popular, and so I don't really know how to say, I don't really know if folks would consider us as relating to however they relate to this larger feminist movement. But I think now in the 21st century, as we are kind of a literary press, I think one thing that we have the resources and ability to do that I think does contribute to social movements as a whole is to help bring institutionalization and access to texts that might not otherwise, sort of persist throughout the years, but also might not be as easily accessible to folks who are then teaching classes about certain movements or just passing on books to people that they know. And so one thing that I think,
can you give some examples? A couple examples?
Book examples? Okay, so there's one right in front of me, Spread, so I'm just gonna choose that. So Spread was this magazine by, for, and about sex work, by sex workers. And it was a print magazine. It had pretty wide circulation, but it was print only, lasted for 10 years, and then after they stopped printing, if you didn't have one of the original issues, you weren't going to be able to access this content. But maybe 20 years down the road, it would be awesome for a professor who's teaching gender studies to have their students read some of the material that was being written in the early 2000s about sex work in the US or internationally. And so we made it into a book. It's in libraries. It's on scholarly databases. I think that if you are a literary press, you can, institutionalization can also sound like such a bad thing, but I think you're also you're hopefully making space for stories that otherwise just would be kind of left behind, and then other stories come to dominate movements, right? And you just don't want the people who are doing the work so early or on the ground to be forgotten and larger, and next to perhaps stories that are more simplistic, I guess.
Right. So one thing I have heard all of you basically say is that one function of radical presses is bringing voices essentially from the margins and just lifting them up. But so as a couple of you also mentioned, we're now in this political moment where radical ideas that a year ago were not even being considered seriously. For instance, think about abolish ICE or whatever. A year ago, that was just not. That would never have been spoken by mainstream politicians or whatever. So now, we're in this moment where these more radical ideas are entering the mainstream, and I'm wondering how exactly do you see your relationship to the mainstream growing social movement?
I think with feminism especially, so 5 years ago or so, when I first started working at the Feminist Press, feminism I think was still this weird word. It seemed really outdated, and people would come by our booth at a festival and really try to argue with us why that shouldn't be our name. And so now I think because sort of public mainstream opinion has changed, no one will outwardly say that, but then we also get a lot more harassy phone calls, because I think the general political landscape is really different. So I guess it's like both good and bad, right? That feminism is like quote unquote more mainstream because these are ideas that shouldn't be so like considered ridiculous that they're like always relegated to the margins. However, I think as things do become more acceptable, often the form that becomes the most accepted is sometimes a more reductionist or simplified narrative, and the folks who maybe already had the most access to platforms continue to be the people who then speak for large groups of people. And so I think what indie or radical or small or nonprofit presses can continue to do is, yeah, like there's going to be like the Lena Dunham book, but you can still be publishing feminist books that are important, and like that space still needs to be created because it's not like the need for like feminist presses has been eliminated. I'd say.
Yeah, like as a collective, like Rebozo, well, first to mention, like being much more based in Mexico. I mean, we do spend some time here each year, but our work is very contextualized within Mexico. It's a very different political climate in that sense. Like there's not, I would say there's no politicians really adopting any of our concepts or themes that we're putting on the table. In fact, there's just not as much attention put on that level, on that scene, at least in the circles that we're in. So personally, we haven't had any kind of reflections around it. It's like not even an issue. We've definitely seen it happening here, and I think like what's interesting is to think about how can we create like alliances, perhaps with like I find what you were just mentioning like very interesting and important. Like when we first started, we also were like when we published Deschooling Society, for example, the first book we published, that was also because like we want to like recover this book out of like from the dust. In Mexico, that was not a book that many people had read, even though Ivan Illich had spent so much of his time in Mexico, and that was where he died and built an entire center, etc. So I think those ideas are really important about not letting these works die. And so what I wanted to say is like hearing you talk about like this institutionalization, which we all, I think, instinctively are like, no, but I think that's so important. So for me, like we are not, I can say like, as a collective, like we're not going to necessarily focus on trying to get our ideas into mainstream politics just because we have more of a focus about building like from below and to the left. We use that phrase, which is from the Zapatistas, which is more about strengthening the movement work that's happening and focusing our energies there. But that doesn't mean it's not important to create like alliances. For me, it would be great to be able to have alliances between presses that perhaps are more historical, like the feminist press, and that are working on different levels of the movement or of society to be able to, amongst ourselves have those connections and push themes. But maybe not all, at least this would be my opinion, like I don't think all press or all publishing has to tackle each, kind of tier. I don't mean it in a hierarchical sense, just kind of imagining society broken down into different zones of influence, like where we all have to figure out, where we can influence or have more of an intersection in that zone. And if we could relate to one another and have these connections, then we can kind of on a more integral or holistic level have these issues permeating. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so I think for us, actually the Abolish ICE thing that you brought up is a great example. We kind of designed and printed some kind of on-the-fly Abolish ICE posters and stickers that people kept asking for and things like that. And I don't think that our goal necessarily is to kind of take these ideas and put them into the mainstream so that you have like mainstream politicians saying abolish ICE. But I do think that it's more important for us to just connect with other people and other groups at the grassroots level until that idea has spread so far and wide that these mainstream politicians kind of like don't have a choice. Like they kind of have, they know that that's kind of where the sentiment is, and you know, whether they're doing it because they actually believe it, or they're doing it to kind of hang on to their seat for a little bit longer. I mean, I think that kind of whatever it takes to get those ideas further out there, because you know, like you said a year ago, that idea was like not even on the table, and now you have like, you know, kind of like maybe the most normal core people being like, oh, maybe we should abolish ICE, you know. And so I think that, you know, our job is to kind of help spread those ideas that are typically on the margins, and just connect with as many people as we can, so that it eventually kind of wiggles its way into the mainstream, and you know, a lot of people who maybe wouldn't have thought that kind of adopt those ideas.
And I guess there's definitely like a difference between a slogan, abolish ICE, which is actually what like mainstream politicians are adopting, and then there's like the whole discussion around it between like radicals and progressives, or within like a single movement about like what that looks like. And I mean, I noticed that you two both mention sort of archival works, or works that are about history. So it's also, I guess, that these like radical publishing is about preserving the history of like movements that are past, so that we don't have to, you know, like reinvent the wheel every single time. But yeah, so like going back then to just the nuts and bolts of like how you sort of generate the kind of discussion that you want within the movement, or create the kind of book that, you know, represents what you're interested in. Like how do you go about, once there's this like event happening, or you see this movement or an issue that's like bubbling up, how do you go about figuring out like whose voice you want to you know, spotlight, or like how do you actually make decisions editorially?
Yeah, I mean, for us it's been a lot of honestly experimenting. Like we started as a very kind of with a very DIY approach. It was very just kind of natural. The people that were involved would just propose different things because we were all actively reading, or we're all actively questioning certain things, or we want to know more about how can we, you know, what would a world look like without transportation. Like I'm thinking of the book we published, without public transportation, where the bike was more our means of. So there are these questions. For us, that's kind of how it's been for the most of our publications, like very based on our internal, like as a group, reflections and discussions. But it's not just an isolated group, because as I mentioned, you know, we're involved in many different organizing efforts or different activities, and then sometimes it would just happen where through an encuentro, which in Mexico, like, you know, gatherings or conferences, maybe we meet somebody who we admire and we've read their work and we just would approach them. Like that's the case with Raul Zibecki, journalist from Uruguay who published a couple of books by, and just the relationship grows out of there, and then it's kind of just a collaboration. It's more an admiration of their work and their work ethic and their principles, and we feel that there's affinity in how we envision the world. So that's kind of how we've done it, which I don't think is like a kind of standard editorial process, but that's how it's been, very like an organic thing where we propose something, we circulate it around the group, everyone reads it ideally, which sometimes doesn't always happen, but that's the idea, and then we decide to print. Yeah. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, we don't actually, just to get like kind of technical and stuff, I don't know, we don't solicit work. So like sometimes bigger political process in the US, like they'll sit around in an editorial meeting and say like, we really need someone to like write about the state of like second grade public education in the US or something, and like who's that perfect person. We don't do that, and it's like not for any particular reason, just a capacity thing, and just we don't feel like as the current team we are, like that is the kind of book that we can do the best. So we look at proposals and manuscripts that come in, we read them We have editorial meetings that are, sort of democratic. We don't vote, but we all discuss them together, and everyone sort of weighs in on how important of a book this is to be a part of our list, which is fairly limited in number. But I guess I will say I think that the few key people, different people at Feminist Press are in different political circles, they're involved in different movements or different parts of a movement, and so they'll often know folks who are maybe non-traditional writers who do have a book. They just don't necessarily have access or even interest in that kind of traditional MFA agent, whatever sort of pipeline, and so I think we are plugged into more grassroots, I guess, circles. I keep saying circles, but and we get books that way, but we don't commission them. I guess that's just a technical thing we don't do.
For us, because we're so new into publishing at this level, Aftermath was actually, we put out a call for submissions on a particular theme, and that theme kind of came out of a story, a piece of fiction that a friend of mine had written. And I had asked him what he thought the theme of the book was, and or the theme of the story was, and he said, "Oh, if I had to narrow it down to one word, I would say Aftermath." It was a story about a character going through a really intense breakup and kind of how that's affecting other parts of his life. And I was like, "Oh, it's an interesting theme." So for us, what we did is we took that theme and we put out an open call that we ran for 3 months, and we got 1,000 submissions. And those submissions ranged everywhere from I've never written a story before, but the theme resonated with me, to, I'm in an MFA program, to, I've written XYZ book or whatever. So for us, and obviously, all the quality of the writing and kind of how much work it needed kind of varied, kind of ran the whole spectrum. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to publish 1,000 pieces of writing in a book, so we did kind of take those submissions, and there's only 3 of us. We have a couple of other folks helping us to read through the submissions, and we kind of narrowed it down to 33. Some of that is photography and illustration too, but basically 33 contributors. So for us, it was basically, is the writing strong? Is there, we didn't want to have multiple pieces about, the death of a parent or whatever. So, how, do we already have a story that kind of addresses the theme in a particular way that we like better or works better for the book for whatever reason, and then we kind of have semi-informal editorial meetings where we kind of talk about what we read, and we kind of the same kind of thing, we don't vote, but we kind of all discuss it and talk about the different parameters, and we have kind of a list of guidelines of what will we publish and why, kind of. So and I think that'll come into play a little bit more when we're doing more novels, but at least for this, it was helpful to know, okay, here's what we're looking for, and then what, how can we take all those pieces and put them together into a cohesive book.
I guess one thing that I should mention is that I don't know how much you all know about corporate publishing, but one thing that Jisu just mentioned is the agent MFA pipeline. In corporate publishing, generally, if you're a writer and you want to get a book published, you have to get an agent, and the agent is the one that will pitch it around to publishers, because they're the ones that have the contacts. And so it's there's definitely an access issue where unknown writers or marginalized voices just don't have access to the publishers, and so that does seem to be a big part of what a radical publisher who has ties to the movement, right, can offer.
Right. And that was a big thing for us too, just being able to, in terms of the guidelines for the story, we wanted to set the maximum word count a little bit lower than is normal, just so that we could essentially have more people represented, because we knew we had limited space and also limited funds to pay contributors. We did pay contributors, which is also another thing that seems kind of rare sometimes. But yeah, so exactly, that was the other thing too, is normal, and that was definitely a priority for us.
Yeah, and just like now you mentioned that, it's a little different, but like one of the big missions, I guess you could say, of Rebozo when we started was also this idea about like, why does the idea of being able to print your own book have to be something so exclusive and only for so few people, and that requires tons of money to do, because you can only print 5,000 or 10,000 copies. And since we are also we print our own material, and we're also printers little by little, we have tried to break down that concept a little and be like, you know, with different people that approach us, like maybe we're not going to necessarily publish it as a Rebozo, like taking it on as one of our list, like you were saying, you know, but we can help people, and we've done this a lot, like organizations or a movement or a person that wants to publish a book, like why not, we can help you print it, we can print like 100 copies maybe, like we've done this a lot, like some people just want like 50 copies of this book, so we'll print it for them, bind it for them, etc. And it's like, makes this idea like, you know, like it doesn't have to be something that only you have to like sign a deal and a contract and hand everything over to some publishing company. And yeah, I just like, that made me think about that aspect of it too.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking because, like, whenever I'm like, you know, day to day, our work does seem really DIY, but at this point, 48 years in, like, we, you know, have some historical significance, and I think that all, like, radical organizations, like, they're placed within, like, a larger movement, or, like, kind of what they're doing for, or what that movement changes over time. And so when we were first founded, we were printing a lot more pamphlets, we were, like, creating just like textbook materials for what was then like a burgeoning like gender studies movement that didn't yet have like kind of like the textbook resources that are a lot more accessible now. But you know, now like what's our role, right? Like we aren't like the same kind of, I guess, like advocacy sort of organization that I think we were in the past. I think like we have a really different role, and I think one of our biggest, I guess, like kind of as a bigger or more established company, one of our like sort of key interests is sort of changing the publishing landscape, like in terms of the industry. Because I do think we are like at this point sort of like know enough or are in the industry enough that we see its problems, but we also have the ability and the energy to try to like shift some of those things. So I don't know, it's just interesting to think like, oh, we're just like at a different place now. Like 30 years ago, someone working in the feminist press just might have had a completely different mission about their role in relation to publishing and the movement.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you two, your mission, or the kind of work you do has like changed kind of recently. So you guys, Radix, started out as printers and then became publishers, where you're like actually commissioning work and then putting out your own book. And then you all started out as publishers, putting out books, and then started printing later. I mean, what was your thinking?
What are you thinking? What are you thinking of? How did you do that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we always started with this idea of printing because we were very big on the idea of having the entire means of production. Like that was always the vision. But obviously, it's something that happens little by little because maybe you don't have like the money to buy all the machines that you need. So it's been a work in progress. And actually, yeah, just to mention that, like this summer, since we've been here, my partner and I, we've been working with Radix, and they've been teaching us different printing techniques because right now we have our own digital printer, and with another printer that we know, we print certain books on offset with him, but we want to be able to incorporate different printing techniques into our work, because basically that's the idea. We want to be able to have complete autonomy over the process, and also, you know, dreams beyond just that is to be able to incorporate other people into the work, to be able to build maybe a cooperative just around printing with younger people in the city where we are, be able to provide different kinds of like autonomous work opportunities, and so yeah, basically for me they go hand in hand. You know, if you can do both, I think it's a beautiful thing. Of course, not everybody has the time or the capacity, but for us it's really cool to have everything under one roof.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started, publishing was always something we wanted to do, and then as our commercial workload got heavier, kind of just fell to the back burner, and then it was really as we entered this era of Trumpism that we were like, okay, this is, if we're gonna do it, we have to do it right now, because there's gonna be a lot of people with a lot of things to say, and they're not all gonna publish a book with Penguin or even the Feminist Press or whatever. For us too, we like having the control of doing everything in house. We're able to make particular decisions about the design, about the paper. We often design for the equipment that we have. So like the cover of Aftermath is all letterpress and has some foil on it. And we really wanted, with our first book, part of it is that we wanted to come out of the gate really strong with, our first book, make a really nice looking object, as well as, content-wise, it's a very good book. But it kind of, with mainstream publishing, and even a lot of independent publishing, I mean, it's all, you're doing the editorial in one place and the design in another place, and then maybe you print locally, or for larger presses, or printing in Canada or China or Belgium or whatever. So for us, I mean, we just wanted, being able to do everything under one roof kind of keeps it more cohesive, and we're kind of able to make the books physically stand out from what you might otherwise see on the shelf, and we're kind of able to we know a lot about paper. We kind of we're able to allocate resources and things like that. Especially if it's for example, you need to order 2 cases of paper or whatever for a job, and we're going to have some left over. A lot of the leftovers turn into posters for promotional material, business cards, bookmarks, and things like that. So it just helps. It's faster. It's a bit more economical. And it makes the books a little bit more cohesive for us.
I mean, you guys do not do everything in-house. Have you found that to be?
I mean, I can't even imagine doing everything in-house. That's amazing. But also sounds like so much work. I don't think that's something I would necessarily want to take on.
Not for everyone.
Yeah, so we don't do the printing in-house. We also have a distributor, so if you were, so you can buy a Feminist Press book on Amazon, but it's not I personally send the book to Amazon, if that makes sense. And I think, with publishing, so much of publishing is being, and I guess this is all businesses, but is being consolidated, right, and being bought up and merged and all these different terms. And I think what's for us, I don't know too much about the printing process. However, I really love the printers we work with. They're independent, and I think they're really holding on, trying their best to hold on in an industry that's just just everything's being bought, and it feels good to be part of an ecosystem that's hopefully hopefully I guess sort of trying to build up against this drive towards making businesses not independent, making them part of large global conglomerates. Yeah, we don't do our printing in-house.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's just 2 slightly different models. When you talk about autonomy, I think you own the means of production for producing books, basically.
I mean, it does make the process a lot faster too, especially when you're very small and lean, and you can say, oh, there's this thing we want to write about. I mean, we could, do, with a solid manuscript, we can do the editing, the design, the layout, the printing, maybe not the binding, but almost every single thing in-house. And so I think that just helps keep the schedule a lot tighter, and we're able to, we don't have to have as much of a, long turnaround for that kind of thing, but
you spend a ton of time on correspondence, right? Which is what happens when you outsource.
Yeah, right. And especially if you're getting galleys
Yeah.
and printed proofs, and they're coming from different places and whatever. It's nice to be able to say, oh, let's print a copy of this to see how it looks. Oh, and then now we can make a change while we're on press. I mean, there's a lot of little tweaking you can do when you own the means of production. But it also can make you angry too. So.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, like, and also, I think, I know Radix does this a lot as well, so for us, part of the idea about having the machines to print is, one thing is, yeah, we can print our own material, but we also see it as a resource that can be made available to the movement. So like, I say Radix, for example, like I know when there's a big march coming up, they'll just like print a ton of posters to be able to like have them present in the march. So we also try and do that kind of stuff. Sometimes there's just needs for the movement, which is such a big term, but you know, the circles or the people, the organizations that you have connections with, and they just need something fast and done in a mutual support or solidarity based way, and that gives us like that possibility too. So we've always seen it as kind of like this tool that can be used to benefit so many, you know, not just our own project.
yeah, and I actually think this is like sort of an idea that's catching on more broadly. Like Naomi Klein is an example. Naomi Klein, like her big climate book, This Changes Everything, was published with like a big publisher, like one of the big corporate publishers. And after that, she said more recently that she's like switching to her like Puerto Rico book, and the book she published right after Trump got elected within like a few weeks. She published with like Haymarket Press, also an independent publisher. And I think one of the things she said was that, yeah, like these smaller publishers can just put something out much more quickly, and also they're like much more willing to just like print stuff that's more radical, you know, that's like not necessarily, I mean, I'm sure everything she publishes will sell, but you know, it's not like their primary concern isn't like profit making, right? And that, I mean, you guys all have to worry about your bottom line and paying, you know, keeping the lights on, whatever, but that's not like your main purpose. So that makes it.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to talk a little bit about, so you guys, the two of you, you work under a cooperative structure, and then you guys work, Feminist Press is a nonprofit, right? So this is, like, these are pretty different from, like, the big corporate publishers. Can you just, like, talk a little about how that actually works? Like, what is the structure of?
Well, we are, so Radix is a worker-owned cooperative. Which is different from maybe like a grocery cooperative that a lot of people are probably familiar with. A worker cooperative is basically a business that is owned and managed by its workers, and so that looks like a lot of different things. There are some cooperatives that are hundreds of people or more. We're just 3 people, so for us, what it means is that we all share in the actual like day-to-day business aspects, all the kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff of a business. So we do the actual work, which is printing, cutting, binding, and then on the publishing side, editorial, and things like that. And then we do the bookkeeping, marketing, ordering, and things like that. And we just make decisions collectively. So. Our meetings are pretty informal, since we're so small, but it does mean that everyone there kind of has a more vested interest in the success of the business. I mean, we share profits, we share losses, we work on, we all work on various parts of our project. We all have ideas for other projects. And everyone's voice is just a lot more heard than it would be if we were working at some other print shop or publisher or whatever. We don't quite have like the red tape that a lot of, especially as you get bigger, like probably Naomi Klein's publishers. I mean, it's just so slow. It's just such a big machine that it just moves so slowly. With us, we're able to get things done. Not everything is more efficient, just because you kind of sacrifice a little bit of that to have everyone be able to weigh in and be happy and feel like their concerns are addressed. But in a lot of other ways, I find that it actually is faster and more efficient, because no one's really micromanaging anyone. Everyone kind of has like the autonomy to kind of like work on their own thing, within reason, you know what I mean? Like we all kind of set those parameters, but it just means that we can kind of just do things, and we all trust each other, and we kind of know where we're at, so.
Yeah, I mean, our structure is pretty similar, so I won't repeat. You know, I mean, it's gone through a few different evolutions, because at the beginning, everybody who was in Rebozo lived in the same place, lived in the same house. It was an entirely shared economy. So within the cooperative structure, there can be quite, you know, varying different levels. Now we're a little bit more like what Lantz is mentioning, which I think is just healthier for everybody. Now we actually are 2 different work nodes, where some of us are based in northern Mexico and others in San Cristobal, southern Mexico. But I would just, to not repeat like similar like structures and the way we make decisions, just like one thing that I'll mention for me is really great about our cooperative structure. Like, it just allows you to have, of course there's like certain principles and things that are agreed upon and structures in place, but it allows you to have a lot more flexibility. We have a big, it's very important for us to have relationships and be in dialogue with, including the places that we distribute books. We're our own distributors, at least at this point, because, you know, we're still fairly small. But it was always like part of our beliefs that, like, whenever possible, we would like to build a relationship with the bookstore or the collective or the coffee shop where we're distributing, to help kind of break down precisely what we're talking about, these like norms in the publishing industry, which just separates everyone out. You know, there's one person here who does the editing, and then over there they do the printing, and then this people do the distributing, and it's all divided. And we try and put like the relationships at the forefront, and that means that we can be flexible. So with each place where we are distributing, or also even just with the authors that we're working with, there's always like a discussion to figure out like what works best in this specific relationship. So even our prices when we distribute, it can be very different from one store to the next. We talk through it, like what's the demographic that's coming to your store? You know, what price do you think these books are going to sell? We don't have, I mean, obviously we have a range, but we vary, you know, because the idea is that the books get out, not that we just, like you said, of course, yeah, we have a bottom line. We can't sell it for less than a certain amount to keep going, but we have that ability to like discuss and be in dialogue and be flexible. And I think that helps, like, yeah, just create different relationships that are the kind of relationships we want to build for a different world, you know.
Yeah, just to jump. So I don't really work on the nonprofit side of Feminist Press, so I'm not like super familiar with the nonprofit world / structure. But we are a 501(c) educational nonprofit, and my understanding is that we became a nonprofit way back when. And what's sort of interesting to me is like I've sort of, it's been very recent that I've tried to learn a little bit more about that side of what my colleagues are doing, especially after Enron, which you would think shouldn't affect like every nonprofit in the US. Like, there are a lot of things that you have to do in order to maintain your nonprofit status that, to me personally, seem prohibitive to a lot of organizations and institutions. And so, I mean, like, I think everyone knows, like, it's not applying for nonprofit status is not necessarily the best thing to do for your organization. But if you are, you know, I mean, you have to be public about stuff. Like, you're not just answering to the people in your office or maybe even your community readers. Like, you're answering to a ton of people, and the decisions you're making should be mission driven. Maybe at a really small organization where all the people, you know, who are involved are really trustworthy and like really, I don't know, like maybe it's not an issue, but I guess, you know, it is important that nonprofits do have some oversight in general. As you can probably tell, I don't know a huge amount about this like model, and I'm not necessarily like a huge proponent of it either. But it is like just seeing all this work we have to do to make sure that we are actually mission driven, that we're sticking to our guns when it comes to diversity and all these things we say we believe in. We're not spending money in ways that aren't mission driven. Like, it is good that, you know, we have to answer to people. We're not just doing things like kind of gonna pay.
Yeah. Do you think that it affects like your editorial decisions though? Like for instance, are you beholden to the people that like fund the nonprofit, for instance? Or
I think that I can imagine situations in which this might happen. I don't think we are. But you know, that like we don't like necessarily have some like great donor who's giving us a lot of money, so we have to like listen to them. Maybe if we did, it would be a different story, but we don't, so there's that. I think that one thing it allows us to do editorially though is we can publish books where the bottom line isn't an issue because we get outside funding or grant support, and like one thing in which that is really clear is like translations. We're really committed to literary translation and fiction and translation. Very small amount of books published in the US every year are from other countries. An even smaller amount of that, as you can imagine, is like written by women or written from regions or countries that are not in Western Europe. And so, you know, that's something that, because it's literary fiction, we do get some support from like government or our government or other governments, and we can do that, right? So that's one way it affects us editorially, but I guess that's like a good way. I mean, I can see how that'd be an issue, and we talk about that. Like, is that a risk that we foresee in the future, and how do we mitigate that risk? We don't ever want to be like bought in that way.
do you all think that how do you think that your like cooperative structure affects your editorial work, or does it?
Yeah, I mean it does. I think also there's good and bad things. I mean for us it depends. Like Lantz was saying that like he thinks their structure makes it faster. Like with us I know that it doesn't. It makes it slower because we're all doing so many other things. Like it's different because with us it's not like we have like a set place where we're going every day or set work times and hours, so everybody has to self-manage their time and everything. And the other people have children and run a bookstore, and we're all doing a lot of things. So it's, I think in this case, it just makes decisions sometimes slower. But of course, for like what you're saying about like the trustworthy thing, the thing is this cooperative, again, it can vary. I think there's so many different ranges of conditions and situations, but in our case it's a cooperative that really is based on not just friendship, but like very deep friendships, but also very strong political convictions and understanding that we're on the same path and that we are looking towards the same horizon. So this creates this kind of trust that makes I never really have to doubt the material that somebody's proposing because I know that I'm in sync with them, and there's this kind of just connection that makes the work flow. And again, like the timing might be like a different thing, but in terms of flowing and being in harmony and synchronized in like where we are, that to me is like a really beautiful strength of the cooperative model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it can, being a cooperative is kind of like being married, and the more people you have, the more people you're married to. You're all very aware of people's, the finances and like kind of all the nitty gritty. But I think that how it affects us editorially is that, in a good sense, we do all share the same like political conviction and things like that. I mean, we are. Just like a nonprofit, we are still mission-driven, even if it's not like, it's a much different like structure or whatever. But we still are mission-driven, and we try to stick to what is part of that mission. So I think that's mine saying bye. Bye. So it means that if there's something that maybe wouldn't fly at another publisher, or something that someone's having like a difficult time, shopping around, or they just don't really know how to get it out there, we're able, if we're passionate about it, we're able to kind of put all the excitement of like 3 different people and kind of get it done. I mean, and then the flip side of that is that there may be a project that someone like really wants to do, and maybe the other people don't, and then so you kind of bicker about it or whatever. And it's just like any sort of like family or any sort of relationship. I mean, it's not always perfect. I mean, there are times where it kind of you kind of work against each other a little bit, but I think the net positive is just that you're able to kind of take the risk that you want to do the work that you want and be happy with it. So I think that's overall the best thing, at least for our our operations, kind of the best thing for us, rather than having someone kind of dictate like, okay, well, here's what's going to happen or whatever.
And one thing that you just mentioned is that you guys are able to fund like translation works, which, by the way, just having like worked in publishing, those translated works tend to be like the most difficult to, like really difficult to sell and find readers for. But I'm wondering, I mean, both of you deal with like a lot of translations. I mean, you translate from Spanish to English, and then you guys translate from like a number of different languages. I mean, I'm wondering like what are the challenges, I guess, of like trying to bridge that language divide and bring ideas across borders.
Yeah, definitely like, I think shortage of fun. It's a very intense work to translate, so I mean, I think it would be nice. Like, we've never really had funds for that. I think it would be nice to be able to have like a team of translators like on project-based basis and be able to fund that. I know there are a few resources out there that try and do that, but we've never had that opportunity yet. Yeah, I think like if people aren't familiar with maybe the author or a certain theme, like if you don't have the opportunity to really dialogue about it, like it's hard to sell it. So like the book fairs, I think, or like tabling places becomes even more important for translated works, because you really need to tell the story. Like it's not just gonna catch somebody's eye. I mean, we've definitely had that experience. So I think if you don't have like that, I don't know about you guys, but like if you don't have that space a lot, I think that's one of the challenges. Like we really have to make sure you have a lot of interaction with your readership or with people that you think would be interested, and be able to talk through it,
Yeah, I mean, the barriers, I think, to translated literature are like a lot of it's just logistical, right? It's expensive because you're paying the original publisher who's paying the author, and then you're paying the translator, so there's more people you're paying, and hopefully you're paying them at what is, a standard rate, or, and then one of the big ways that you connect readers, right, like you're saying, like with books, is like through events at like libraries or festivals or bookstores or whatever. But if your author lives in a different country, I mean, like that's added cost, right? If you want to help support their marketing and publicity. So, like, there are a lot of barriers, and it's all just really about like money, I guess. But that being said, like, if you are a romantic about literature, which I guess I am, and think that one of the reasons you engage with like literary arts is to access perspectives and ideas that are not your own. I mean, hopefully we're not, staying still when the majority of literature published in the country that we're currently in is from other people who are living in this country. And obviously there's like a diversity of voices here, but there's also this like whole other like rest of the world and a whole other like the rest of like languages and so it's logistically very hard, but I think we're very committed to it, and I don't think like it would be something we'd ever consider giving up.
You all have mentioned is like the importance of like actually having physical space or like events or workshops, and being able to actually like engage with people. And so I guess the advantage to being like a movement publisher or somebody that's like, you know, already circulating among people who like actually care about the issues that you're writing about is that, yeah, you have these like built-in relationships, and maybe you do have like, you know, you can like go to movement spaces or whatever. But I guess the difficulty with being a small publisher is that you might not have the resources to, you know, maybe table at bigger things like the Brooklyn Book Fest, which is happening tomorrow. And so, I mean, I'm wondering about just like industry-wise, is there stuff that, are there like, have you guys ever thought about forms of like organizing yourselves, like between presses, or is there other kind of like institutional support that would help small presses? Like what? Yeah.
Well, we're members of the CLMP, which is the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses, and they've been around for, you know, I think what, maybe like 30 years or something like that, about that. So we do get a lot of support. There's a couple of different listservs that where you know, people can ask for advice and things like that. There's also an events listserv where people can kind of promote book launches and other events. And they also do offer members like technical support, where you can kind of like, you know, go to their office or, you know, hop on the phone or whatever with, you know, their executive director, who kind of like helps you work on your mission statement or help you figure out how to, you know, publish your first book or whatever. So that's just something in terms of like, as like a dues organization, that does exist for small publishers, and their dues are really reasonable, and I would say it's definitely worth checking out. They have a lot of resources on their website for members, with different documents on, you know, publicity, marketing, fundraising, all that kind of stuff. So they've been really supportive, and they've been really helpful. And then, yeah, just, you know, because we kind of already have the background in radical politics, like you're saying, I mean, we can hold like literary events in movement spaces, or we at least like can kind of connect with people that, you know, a lot of radicals, they kind of, you know, not a lot of people are reading fiction and poetry and things like that, and so when you say, oh, here's an anthology, it's kind of like, oh no, but it's like more literary, where it's like it's like mostly short stories and poetry and like a few essays and things like that. And that's just a way to kind of get you know, get those ideas to people who normally might not read that stuff, and, you know, then that kind of, you get a lot of like word of mouth going and stuff like that too. So that it is helpful to kind of have those connections, you know, already, and kind of be in that space. Thanks. Did you like that? Thank you. Thanks for the support.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are also members of CLMP in the sense that we pay dues, but we're actually, so I actually just came from this thing where people are trying to set up this group called the Independent Publishers Caucus, which is kind of like CLMP, but for publishers who are maybe like just more similar in their like business strategy model, whatever scale, because the way you operate is different, so the kinds of knowledge or like advice or whatever you need are just different. And I was thinking, like, I do think these sorts of industry guild organizations are incredibly important, because one of the ways that, like, other than the actual just like mechanical resources or financial resources, one of the ways that folks consolidate, like, I guess like space or like one of the ways where it becomes difficult for people to break in is because they don't have like administrative knowledge of how to like do things, right? And if all of that knowledge gets consolidated at big houses, or, you know, doesn't get passed down or isn't shared freely, like, that's as much of a barrier as like not, you know, owning the means of production or not having, you know, financial funds. And so I think, I don't know, to me, like, that's such an important part of it's like kind of nerdy and like you get to like talk about budgets and stuff like that. But I think that kind of sharing is so important, and it's vital to social movements that you don't like keep this administrative knowledge locked up, because that stuff is so valuable.
It's very difficult to learn how to publish a book.
Absolutely.
If you ever just like Google how do I publish a book, it's
Yeah.
kind of like all of it is like almost 100% of the results you get are geared towards like self-publishing, and if that's not what you want to do, like you want to publish other people, but it's like, oh, how do I build like a publishing season, or how do I like, where do I start marketing? You know, it's like,
yeah, you could have everything, but like you still like, you know, like you wouldn't have the keys or whatever to get into the door.
Right.
And so yeah, I agree. I think things like selling and stuff are so important, and you know, obviously political movements have had similar things that play an equally important role in like sharing and also passing down information about organizing.
Yeah, we really haven't, like, I guess, I know there are larger independent presses in Mexico that do work on a similar level, but in fact, like, through our time with Radix this summer, like, we shared a lot of our experiences, and, like, we kind of realized, like, we really haven't spent much time, for better or worse, on a lot of these questions like marketing. We've never done any marketing. Like, yeah, we do social media presence and things like that, but we're kind of, I guess, a little bit on like a different level. I don't know what that means, like what the levels are, but it through our time with them, like it kind of made me realize, I think like being in the US definitely demands a certain things that I guess in Mexico we haven't had to yet. And now that we're sort of we've been around for 7 years, we are growing at a smallish pace, but we are growing, so we're getting to a point now where we're starting to like assess, like, do we want to take on some of these more, the things that basically the industry demands of you, which would mean like marketing and like sending out, you know, maybe to a bunch of different bookstores, sending out little, you know, flyers and catalogs and those kind of things. We really haven't done that. So that's like something that I think we're gonna assess together, and it's helpful to be in these kind of spaces and like share with Radix to kind of like put it in perspective and assess like if that's something we want to do. But just to share from like our experience around that so far, like around this supporting one another with other editorials, or, like we've pretty much up to date so far, it's been more based on like these kind of mutual support structures or collectives or groupings. There's been a few different ones where we live. There was an effort to create like a network of independent editorials, what we participated in for a couple of years. It didn't really translate to much. I think the idea is great. Like, how can we organize ourselves like a bunch of different editorials who maybe don't, one alone have the buying power, the money to be able to get into these big fairs, but if we come together, we can have a shared stall, and that worked, but it was kind of controlled by one person, and therefore a lot of decisions were only in her hands, and it kind of has fallen apart. And then I'll just share, like, on the other side, it's not specifically around publishing, but we have a project that's a mutual support-based distributor, and it's not just books. It's a bunch, we're like 6 different cooperatives. It's a very small project, but we have these agreements. Some make chocolate, some make mezcal, some make the like hand-embroidered little bags that we were selling today. We make books, so there are all these different cooperative or family-based projects that the idea is, how can we support each other to kind of avoid these, what sometimes looks like one route that capitalism provides us for selling our products. It's like, this is the only way to get your product out. Again, sometimes, like, we're at this point now, we're like, of course there's times where we have to go that route, because maybe we decide we want to have these books in whatever place, that's fine. But we are very like committed to trying to find kind of these alternative or underground or side routes to get our material or our products into places or into hands of people that we trust and that we know are really going to sell our products with the same passion that we make them. So like we sell the chocolate that our friends, the cooperative makes, and since we know everything that's behind that product, the political mission behind it, the story about it, how they built it up from the ground, we, as like their distributors, we're going to sell it with a different care and a different feeling and tell their story, and that's different than just sending it to some random distributor who has like 500 other books that or whatever that they're going to sell and can't tell that whole story. So that's kind of where our efforts have been up to now.
Books.
So we've been going about an hour, and I could listen to you guys all day, but I want to wrap up and like give you guys all a chance to ask some questions. So just to close out, is there like one thing, one book, or something that you have coming up that you're super psyched about? Or an event?
No,
or
you
whatever.
already started talking about yours.
This year?
The one that's coming.
Yeah.
I'm trying to decide.
You want me to say it?
Yeah, say it again.
So we're doing a science fiction chapbook series called Futures, and it's basically going to each story is going to be an individual chapbook that's going to be released individually and then collected in a box set late next year. And kind of the theme behind it is looking at critical contemporary issues in an imagined future. So what does the future look like if we really do abolish ICE, or what do labor unions look like in some far distant future, and sex work, other kinds of work. Basically the issues that are that we're talking about now, what would those things look like or not look like in the future? And so we're hoping that we have a few locked in already, and then we're kind of going through submissions right now for the rest. So that's going to be coming up early next year.
What about kids' books?
None as of yet, but it's on our list.
That is on our list too.
That's on their
Our
list,
goal
yeah.
in this year is to print our first kids book. So we'll send it to you when we get it. Yeah, that's one. And then I guess just
Super good
the
point.
next book that the next project is basically like this collective that we're part of. It's called Nuevo Solidario, Solidarity Node. It's an international collective. We're going to be hosting our second encuentro this year at the end of the year. And we're going to be printing like a pre-encuentro book that's kind of a reflection of last year's gathering, encuentro, which basically brought together voices from different movements around, definitely a lot in Mexico, but on a global scale, from the United States, from different parts of Europe, from different parts of Latin America, principally. And this year we're going to have that again, and the idea is like to kind of, in a book, bring these voices together and share a bit of like what the reflections that come out of the encuentro are. And yeah, kind of excited about that.
Yeah, this just happens to be a book that's forthcoming this fall that I really love. It's called The Naked Woman. We're publishing it in November, and it's just this very short novella. It was originally published in Uruguay in 1950, and the author, Armenia Summer, was like a writer and pedagogue, and her work has never been available to an English-speaking audience, in like an entire book hasn't been. And it's a very weird, like cynical book about this idea of whether or not civility is equal to social progress.
Cool. Final words? Or no?
Thank you.
Thank you.
for
Yeah.
coming and listening.
Books,
Thank you all.
bookmarks, and
Yeah.
posters.
Books, bookmarks, and posters.
You've got the
Three
final
important
word.
things.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah, check out, you all have websites and Facebook pages, and
Thank you.